To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Welcome to the latest edition of Islands at War with myself, Keith Pengelly, and of course...
Nick Lahira.
Hi, Nick. Okay, so Nick, we are in February 1944, and there certainly seems to be a little bit of optimism that maybe, just maybe, 1944 will see some sort of resolution in the conflict.
Well, some of them seem to think we're hurtling towards the end of the war.
Yes.
Unfortunately for them, not quite as quick as they think.
No, but this is people from the, if we put it, the higher echelons of society, etc. But tell me about Ambrose Sherwell, where he is at the moment and what he writes.
So he's in Laufen camp in Germany at the moment. He's been deported and interred along with many other Channel Islanders. I think it was around 2,000 in total from all of the islands. And he writes back for certain for autumn.
Yeah, home for autumn for certain. I mean, it really is quite a sort of emphatic statement, isn't it?
This is only supposition, but bearing in mind he's in Germany, you can see what's going on and the absolute weight of bombing that's going on. That's possibly, he's probably sat there thinking they're going to give up soon.
Yeah,
because any sane person would have given up by that point. We've lost the war. We lost it at least probably 2 years ago, to be honest.
What they must have had German guards or functionaries in the camp.
That probably influenced them as well in terms of Germans. There's a fabulous photograph of, I'll put this on our social media and on the link to the show notes, but there's a fabulous photograph, a group photo from Laufen with Sherwell in the middle. He's the camp senior, so he's in charge of the camp. Then there's a Mr. Anderson of the Westminster Bank, Guernsey, and there's a man from Barclays Bank who doesn't get mentioned either, but that's quite a pertinent reference, which we'll come to later on about those two chaps, the bankers. Then there's a Mr. J.J. Everson, and that name rings a bell with me, but I can't place why I know that name. And I had a look through my records, and I couldn't really quite see what he was about. But I need to do some more digging on him. I was running out of time yesterday when I was doing that. And then there's a Mr. Morgan of the post office in Guernsey, and also at the back row next to him is Mr. Arrowsmith. I bet that's an Arrowsmith connected with Arrowsmith.
I suspect.
The dry cleaners that still exist.
But it's an incredible photograph because they look, they're in sort of lounge, some of them are in lounge suits, and it's the most, they're just dressed up for the photograph.
I think they did get dressed up for the photograph. You know, ties on. Yeah. Best shoes.
And of course, we should just remind people that Sherwell previously had been head of the government. What was he, procureur?
Attorney General.
Attorney General. He was a leading figure in Guernsey prior to his detention. We've covered his life story to a degree in earlier episodes, but he did play a part in Guernsey after the war, didn't he? So he's someone that will feature again and again.
Oh, yes. Yeah, very much.
Okay. Now, Armistice Day in German camp. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so Sherwell has written to his daughter, Mary Rose Sherwell, and he says that he'd had a busy day with representatives of the protecting power, so that's the Swiss. They were there, and they were looking after the interests of the campmates. If you've listened to some of the earlier episodes, he got himself in bother because he started getting the protecting power interested in what was going on in the Channel Islands, and the Germans took a very dim view of that and basically told him you're only allowed to talk to them about what's going on in the camp. But yeah, listeners might be surprised that he was allowed to organise an Armistice Day remembrance at the graveyard near the.
Yeah, he had a day out.
Yeah, along with Padre Gerhold of St. Stephen's Church in Guernsey, they go and lay some wreaths. There's a 2-minute silence, which was observed in the graveyard and in the camp. Wherever the internees were within the camp, they were allowed to observe that silence. So, and he said he had a delightful walk last week to an old castle dating back to the 8th century. So now, don't go thinking that it's all, chocolate and roses. It's very much not. They did have a degree of, I was about to say freedom, that's not what I meant, but they were able to get out of the camp from time to time to go for walks and things like that.
Because there's a difference between a POW camp, a difference between a concentration camp, and a difference between a detention camp. Is
very, very big difference.
And then when I first became aware of what we're going to talk about next, which some time ago, this really seemed quite bizarre, isn't it? But Red Cross parcels are being sent from the camps back to the islands.
So those that have been deported are acutely aware of what conditions are like in the Channel Islands. And despite the fact that they need this Red Cross stuff themselves, they know that they're not as bad off and not as badly off as those at home. So they actually save stuff from their Red Cross parcels. They save it up and they send it back to their relatives and friends in the Channel Islands. Now, they wouldn't have known this at the time necessarily, but whether some of the stuff made it here or not, certainly there's plenty of evidence that these parcels did make it here, but how many were lost along the way? Who would have?
Well, one way or another, because of infrastructure being down or theft, possibly.
Yeah, or just in bombing and ship.
Okay, now, this is an interesting one. Life goes on, even in the camps, as far away as Hong Kong.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered this, but there's a report of a marriage in an internment camp. The marriage of Miss Peggy Sharp, daughter of Mr. Eric Sharp, son of the late headmaster of the intermediate school, and the late Christine Lemfesty of St. Peter in the Wood, Guernsey, took place recently in the Stanley internment camp in Hong Kong.
Now, this of course is under the Japanese. So a marriage, two people got married in a shared camp, possibly a camp that was shared couples, a bit like we saw in Empire and the Sun, the film, the Ballard's film.
It would have been a camp. Maybe she knew him before they were put in the camp. Who knows?
But our understanding of captivity under the Japanese was pretty brutal. But I think this is more of a civilian detention camp as opposed to a military camp. Again, we got that difference.
Still very brutal. But.
So, but news had got as far away as
got to England to the so it ended up in the Channel Islands Monthly Review for February.
Yeah, so the Japanese were allowing messages to go out then through the Red Cross.
Yeah, it would have been a Red Cross message. Anyway.
I'd never considered whether the Japanese ever allowed that, but obviously they did. It's quite incredible.
Yeah.
Now this is a funny one. This is help Germans to load a pig is the headline, and this is of course we're all over the world now. This is taking place at. Where are we?
We're in Italy.
We're in Italy. A gentleman, a Guernseyman, taken prisoner at Brook, and he's sent to an Italian prison camp in Ancona. Do you want to take us from there, Nick?
Yeah, so he manages to escape. Now, obviously, if you're escaping, getting rid of your uniform is probably a good idea. Although quite a few people who escaped did obviously keep their uniform on underneath civilian clothing because they wanted, or they hoped that would help them under the Geneva Convention and they wouldn't be shot. However, he discarded his dress as a civilian. He spent 51 days walking over 400 miles across Italy. He met various friendly Italians along the way. He met the Italian resistance who gave him food and helped him on his way. And on one occasion, he actually helped two German soldiers to load a pig into a cart. They mistook him for an Italian as he spoke the language. He got bombed for 2 days by British planes, and he managed with great difficulty to get through the German lines to reach the British. He got a great welcome, plenty of food. Corporal Sarchet, whose parents are still at Cherbourg Road, Guernsey, volunteered during the early days of the war. Now, after leaving England, he's eager for more overseas service. You see that so much, actually.
Yeah.
The Italian, I must dig out some more notes because there are a number of Channel Islanders who escape in Italy from POW camps. There's another chap who went on to go and fight for 10 months with the Italian partisans.
Well, there's a book, as you're quite aware, Nick. Was it Islanders and Kickback?
Yeah, Islanders and...
And there was a gentleman that lived just around the corner from myself when I was a child, Len Dodd. And he had spent time with the partisans. He escaped because the Italians had given up by now, hadn't they?
Yeah, they had. Yeah,
they fractured completely.
They switched sides. So yes, but of course the Germans were still in the country. So
yeah, I mean, I just wonder what it was like to have that adventure. I mean, you probably just want to get back to it.
It seems like Mr. Sarchet there, Corporal Sarchet, keen to get back to the action.
Now this is interesting because there's lots of myths around how the Channel Islanders are connected with serving in the forces over the years. But now Channel Islanders resident in the UK are now affected by the call-up, and the King is involved in this.
Now, yeah, this is a funny one because we've talked about national service and kind of how it works and the quirks and the cock-up with the law when they brought the law in and too little too late, etc. But I'm still slightly confused by this article because long story short, going back to how the law worked, basically they made a mistake when they were drafting the law to conscript because Channel Islanders couldn't be called up to go and serve overseas. Now, most people had gone already, who were of military age, had already gone by the time they got around to drafting the law in 1940. And those that hadn't, the Germans arrived.
Can I just clarify that? Because we'd had people that would have left the Channel Islands to join up before the Germans arrived, people of military age that evacuated to the UK, that even though they were evacuee, they then joined up.
Yeah,
so you had two different classes there.
Absolutely. But now, because they made a mistake in the drafting of the law, you had to be resident in the UK for at least 2 years to be compulsorily called up. So I'm a bit bemused here because it says that the King's given approval for a change to an order in council, altering the rules affecting those from the British dominions and colonies living in Britain. So I think this must have been an order that it was much more wide-ranging.
It's all embracing.
And we just got caught up in it because it actually says that if they've been in Great Britain for at least 2 years, then they can be called up. Well, we were already in that boat from the law, so I think they've just picked this up and said,
as Channel Islanders, we weren't targeted. We were just included because they're talking about South Africans and Canadians and Australians, etc.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's the Dominions, colonies, British protectorates. And so basically, they're just casting around for anybody else that's turned up in Britain.
Is this connected to the big push to D-Day, get manpower in?
It could be. I mean, you're only 6 months from D-Day, so you've probably got time to train them, I guess.
Yeah, because the other side of it is if you're pushing troops out onto the continent on the basis that D-Day was a success, you'd also want people in uniform back at home because these people couldn't have been trained up in that short time to take part.
They could have trained them in time.
Yeah, really?
Yeah, they could have trained them in time. Well, training times were relatively short at that.
Moving on, bank plans in readiness. Now, this includes. Nick, you talk us through this.
We're going to mention banks a few times during this episode, but Midland Bank's chairman in London issued a statement. Mr. Stanley Christopherson, JP. He was their chairman. He included the following passage. Here I would like to say a word about those branches of the bank in the Channel Islands which have been cut off from us by enemy invasion. Our plans are made for resumption of our former activity at the earliest practicable moment in the course of liberation, and I would assure Channel Islanders, whether refugees in this country or serving in HM forces, they shall not lack the fullest possible financial support from the bank when the time comes for them to embark upon the task of rehabilitation. So he's obviously he's saying, we're open for business. He doesn't know when he's going to be open. No. I mean, if he's being as optimistic as Sherwell, he probably thinks he's open for business at the end of the year, but he has to wait a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think there's this general sort of belief that the war can't be dragging on for that much longer. So we're almost, we are thinking about after the war, and we'll come across other instances of that in different ways.
Yeah, on a serious note, he is probably making that statement to reassure people that they will have a functioning banking system when they come back to the island.
Right, Red Cross messages loaded in Granville. We talked about whether Red Cross messages and parcels and all sorts of things are getting through. There are some here that were loaded into the hold of a ship in Granville and then meat loaded on top.
Yeah, and they had to be dumped when they got here.
Yeah, they're soaked in blood and thrown away.
Yeah, not uncommon for that to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, requisition of wireless sets explained. Now, there's a lot about wirelesses in February, but the sets were taken away as a punishment?
They were a punishment, but this strange reference to it being a German saying it was a punishment for 1919.
I can only think that this is the punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty and very much one man's view, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be.
Yeah.
But we've got a lot about wirelesses in this episode. All radios for you modern kids.
Yeah, yeah. They weren't streaming then. Now there were lots of searches and such for lots of informers, or lots of people that were informers informing on several different occasions.
Yeah, the informers thing. It's so difficult to know how many there actually were. People had grudges and that. But there's a talk of one guy who went round and basically pointed out 50 different houses.
How would he have known? I mean,
I don't know, but the Germans were offering 25 quid.
Yeah, so is this 25 searches, not 25 radios being found?
Yeah, who knows? But the Germans were offering 25 quid for information. People sent in spurious information just to keep the Germans busy, as well as those that were actually genuinely informing. And knowing the exact quantum of informers is difficult.
Yeah. Now, the reason for doing so, money, is obviously some out of jealousy or and slights, possibly even pre-war. Some, Nick, perhaps out of fear. Why would have an informant been?
Yeah, I think if they were in trouble for something else,
they were trying to dig themselves out of a different hole.
Yeah. Potentially. They're even down to searching wood piles in the rain to go and look for radios. When we go back to the informers, Ord records that he was talking to a chap who said he was ashamed to be a Guernseyman. Now, there was a massive uptick in February 44 of searches for radios, so I think that's probably why they're assuming that there were a lot of informers. And obviously, there were some, but how many, who knows? And whether it's just the fact that they went looking because things are going badly for Germany. They don't like people listening to the radio and finding out what's really going on in the outside world. That's the crux of the matter.
Yeah, and there's always the possibility they just give troops something to do, like go and search houses.
Yeah, I mean, and there's on the website, islandfortress.com, I've got an article I wrote ages ago about a German that was based down along the west coast at Basel. And every time he got ordered to go and search for radios, he'd make loads of noise.
Right, yeah.
When he's coming up the garden path and whatever, give people plenty of time. And even he made no effort to actually find them, to the extent that he actually got quite friendly with a lot of the locals. Yeah. And in that weird gap between the liberating forces arriving and getting organised, he was going around for tea with these people after 9th of May 1945. He was being invited round because they knew damn well that he made sure that they didn't get caught. Yeah, it did. But there were some, obviously, that were more enthusiastic. Now, probably the best known case of radios getting people into trouble was also in February 44. There was a news sheet which was distributed. It was called Guns, Guernsey Underground News Service. And unfortunately, they were betrayed. They were betrayed by an Irishman, actually. He was friendly with them. He was friendly with Charles Mashon from Guns, and then for some reason chose to betray them to the Germans, because these guys have been copying down the news from the radio and distributing news sheets to various people. And you could go into, we've mentioned this before, you could go into Lloyd's Bank. If you were asked the right question, you could go and have a look at it. You could go to the library if you knew which book to go and look in, and things like that. And unfortunately, Charles Mashon died in Germany. Joseph Gillingham also did not return home, was presumed dead in 1947. They didn't find his final resting place until 2016. We've talked about Frank Fuller before. He was involved in this, Ernest Legg and Cecil Duckman. They all survived, but they continued to suffer for the rest of their lives. It was a terrible experience. There was another publication, GASP, Guernsey Active Secret Press. They didn't get caught. They put out their last news sheet, I think, just before the liberation.
Yeah, so essentially what the information contained on these news sheets was transcriptions of BBC news. Was there any other information that was in there?
No, I think that's probably covers it off. They were putting these news sheets out so that people who didn't have radios or were too scared to have a radio, couldn't access one, that they could actually.
And these were printed?
They were typewritten. Typewritten. The common factor is some of these guys worked for the newspaper.
Now, you've unearthed some incredible statistics. Statistics are always difficult to talk about the wireless or in the podcast.
Yeah, we'll keep this brief, but there's a couple of interesting bits.
You'll summarise it for us, but I think there's a really quite a good book here on this, isn't there? Radio Prosecutions into Stats. Paul Sands' book.
It's Paul Sands, Gilly Carr, and Louise Walter. It's called Protest, Defiance and Resistance in the Channel Islands, and it's a really good book. I
haven't got that, but I will get that.
I can't remember how much it was. I know I got it on a deal, but it's a really good book if you want to understand. My pet hate is people saying, "Oh, nobody in the Channel Islands did anything to this," and this book is brilliant because it sums it up. It's all about defiance and protest
and disobedience is the word I like to use.
Yeah, and things like that. You can't go off blowing stuff up. That's not going to work. You're going to get caught. Well, you're more likely you're going to get shot. But there were other ways, and in some ways more irritating.
Yes.
So the radios were really the Achilles heel of the Germans, and they started. I mean, they confiscated them for the second time in June 1942, and that turned out to be right up until the liberation. That this kept the German courts busy. You'd be arrested and put on trial. The total number of these convictions in Guernsey is not actually that large. It's 64. They weren't that good at catching people. And then there's slightly bigger numbers in Jersey. There's 178 convictions in Jersey.
But Jersey did have a larger population.
Double the population still left in the island. So that's going to make a difference for starters.
Well, there's a very interesting as well, the way that the stats are presented in the book is looking here, Guernsey radio offences, correlation between age groups and sex. And you can see on the graph, I know it means nothing to people listening, but it's an incredible amount as we head towards liberation. As you said, it was almost as if people had a little bit of, because this is post-D-Day period primarily, and people are thinking, throw caution to the wind almost.
Yeah, between February and April 1944, it's quite a few. Then the Germans seem to lose interest in the summer, probably because they were a bit busy. Days happened, and then it all kicks off again in sort of August 1944, and you see a big spike in December and January, February 1945. But it's across age groups as well. There's anything from anyone from 11 to 80 years old. But yeah, I just thought that was an interesting little snippet to stick in there.
Okay, moving towards this interesting note in the Gazette Officielle. So this is a state notice that's being published in the local paper about the Germans demanding that when members of the German forces enter shops and other establishments, they're to be given priority in service. Nick, I thought this had happened some time ago.
Yeah, it had happened previously. This is almost like a reminder. This came off the back of an incident in February 1944 where a German went into a barber's and basically jumped the queue, and it caused a massive kerfuffle. The barber got into trouble because he was remonstrating with the German, and I think they've obviously just decided that this notice. Now, this notice is put out by the civilian government, signed by Durat John Leal, but you need to read the words. This is the key thing with a lot of these things where the government putting out notices. He says, I am directed by the Feldkommandantur. So he's making it quite clear, I don't want to do this. It's not my idea.
I'm forced to do it.
To warn all concerned that he has ordered that members of the German forces must be given prior attention in all shops and other establishments frequented by them, and severe punishment will be imposed on any who disregard this order. No threat of death this time,
No, I noticed that. But there's clear signalling of separation between the German military authorities and the Guernsey government.
Absolutely.
There's clear daylight between those there.
Which is exactly why when the editors of the newspapers, they used to let all sorts of grammar and spelling errors through so that people would know that if something was in the paper and it was full of mistakes, it was because it was written by the Germans, even if it was pretending not to be written by the Germans.
Yeah. It's subtle but effective. Now, the other thing that we're talking on about informers and things here, that in Violet Carey's book, she's talking about spy who haunts buses. haunts the buses? Is this somebody sitting earwigging on the bus?
Yeah, Violet Carey, actually, she was a bit worried. Her previous bus journey, she'd had two bus journeys in the last week. Now, when she got on the first bus journey to come to town, she was coming to town to go and visit some friends. She'd packed herself a little bag of things so she could stay overnight with some friends in St. Peter Port. And she says in her diary that she got on the bus and realised she was the only non-German on the bus. It was some tank men and various other Germans, and she suddenly thought, "Oh, have I got on the wrong bus? Am I on their bus?" But aside from that, on her return journey, which she mentions here in the diary, she says Mr. Chuk and Buggle were at the bus depot, and they were talking about a spy who haunts the buses. And after they described him, I realised he was on the bus with me last Friday. A pleasant youth who never sits down but stands up talking to the driver the whole time and gets in and out for everybody, helping them with their baskets, etc. He also sits in bars at public houses listening for people to tell the news. And Buggle had told Violet also another story about...
Sorry, this chap, there's no suggestion that he was a Guernseyman.
No, he could have been anybody, yeah. And Violet goes on to say that Buggle tells her another story of illustrating the German police methods. He said he was rung up on the phone and told, "German police calling." They asked him if he had a cow. He thought they were talking about cross purposes and asked them if they meant a motor car, and they said, "No, a cow." He told them he had no animals. Then they asked him about another Buggle. Had he a farm? He said, "I don't know. If you would call it a farm, he has a bungalow and a field and a cow." He said all the time they were becoming politer and politer. They said, "You have answered quite correctly. We have examined this place and we have been all over your place." Did that? Buggle said he did not know that. But that's how they're trying to catch people out.
So when they say they've been all over his place, they've broken in to his house.
Who knows? Or whether they just mean, around the outside of it and things like that.
Oh.
But they used to break up people in the street, even groups of people that were talking, 2 or 3 people talking. They separate them and demand to know what they were talking about and see if they could catch them out. If one said one thing and the other said the other, and they'd take them off and question them.
Yep. Okay. Well, we'll go back to Reverend Ord here. This odd situation. Ord was out in the street in his ceremonial robes. He was a minister, Methodist minister. I think he'd been to the full-on chapel and probably conducted a funeral. And so he's walking along dressed in his robes, and an elderly OT man, organisation Toad, sees him and gave him the Nazi stretch, which is the Nazi salute. And Ord tells his friend Reinhold about this, and Reinhold laughs. Reinhold, obviously a German, laughs and says the man must have thought that Ord was from the court of martial law. So sort of almost a muscle memory kicked in and the guy gave him a salute.
Either that or he wasn't sure and he thought, I'll play it safe. One of the two, I guess.
Excuse me. Okay, right. Well, we had a representative of the French Red Cross visit the island, one Madame Danel, and she's here ostensibly to visit Algerian prisoners of war. So these would have been slave workers, Nick, or would they have been Organisation Toad?
They were Organisation Toad.
They wouldn't have really bothered sending a Red Cross person over for slave workers. So these were Algerians, which would have been come under the jurisdiction of France at the time. And Louis Guillemet, our government liaison with the German forces, was disappointed that she was not here to address Guernsey issues directly. And she did the round of island notables.
Yeah, the great and the good.
No, and she really... It says everybody finds her charming and everyone hopes she will help. I think she did take a list of medical supplies that were required.
Yeah, and she promised to report that in Paris to the Red Cross. What they subsequently found out on the radio, and it's not in my notes here, but what they found out very shortly after she'd gone back was the Red Cross building in Paris had actually been destroyed while she was here, or certainly severely damaged.
How did that come about? Paris wasn't bombed, was it?
I'm not entirely sure exactly how that came about, but whether it was the resistance or something, and something went wrong, or who knows.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, she went to see, Baron de Coudenhove. By this time, he was the former...
He was the French consul.
Yeah, he'd retired due to ill health by this point and been replaced by Lambert. But yeah, Baron de Coudenhove, so she goes to see him. Raymond Fuller, the bailiff, Dr. Simmons, our wonderful doctor who really, really annoys the Germans, and they really, really hate him. So I'm sure they were overjoyed that she went to see him. She went to see the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, Blanchland. Everybody thought she was really charming. Everybody was hoping that she would help. In fact, they're actually really worried because when she leaves the island, there's a German. She went by ship, obviously, and the convoy's attacked off of Jersey by torpedo boats, and some ships are sunk and severely damaged. So Louis is actually quite worried.
Yeah, and so really, her visit didn't really achieve anything then, really, did it?
Well, I guess not. I mean, we don't know what happened with the information that she did get back.
And what's this here about Violet Carey is reporting about this woman bringing in a revolting message at the field commandant?
Yeah, it probably doesn't help that I seem to have only put half the note in there. But so a lady called Leonie Truteau was dragged off to be interviewed at the Feld Commandantur at Grange Lodge. She was, at the time, was the head of the Red Cross Bureau, and a woman had brought in what Violet describes as a revolting message, saying that they had plenty of food and that the Germans were so kind to all of us and all that sort of thing. Leonie had refused to send the message, and the woman had reported her to Grange Lodge. So Leonie got pulled in, questioned, and then they just let her go after that. But it certainly would appear that she must have been quite a strong woman, because she basically told them where to go. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier in the programme about banks will play sort of quite a big part in today's episode. There's this incredible story here that British banknotes handed in by the savings bank are being held in Paris for safety. What's all that about?
Right, so what happened was the Germans turned around and told the civilian government here that the money was transferred between here and the banks in Paris so that they could use the money.
What currency are we talking about here?
So this is where it gets really complicated. It was British banknotes.
Yeah, so sterling.
Yeah, was transferred to the British banks that were still operating in France.
So they'd taken sterling out of circulation in the Channel Islands, gave it to the Germans, held it in Guernsey Savings Bank.
Yeah, and it was transferred to France, to their branch in France.
Okay, so a British bank in Paris.
And then the Germans said it was being held there for safety. We'll look after it for you. Thanks very much. What normally would have happened prior to this was it was then swapped for francs to be able to buy supplies for the islands.
Here on the island?
No, in Granville.
In Granville, yes.
Yeah, to ship here.
So essentially, the Germans have stolen the money.
Yeah, basically. The Germans insist that it's going to keep it safe because it wouldn't be safe to move it around and all this sort of stuff. And Durat Lille is recorded as thinking that the claim was so absurd, he actually sticks out his tongue in disbelief. Major Kratzer catches him and says he doesn't understand why they're surprised. I mean, I'm not sure he's particularly surprised. I mean, he's just, do you really expect me to believe it's complete and utter codswallop that you're trying to feed us? I mean, and then things get worse. I mean, it goes from bad to worse. A new order arrives later on in February saying that all surplus marks held by the states, that's our government, must now be handed to the German paymaster for nothing in return. The Germans think this is advantageous as it avoids the risk of transporting it. How that is advantageous for the locals, who knows? Louis has done some sums and he calculates the impact. A deficit of nearly £1 million is caused by this, which in today's money in February 2026 is about 39 million quid. That's a big chunk of money. And by the time we get to the end of the war, Guernsey's 6 million in debt caused by the occupation. So it's really made a big difference. The Germans are shrugging it off. They don't understand why Lille and Louis are so bothered about it, because they think that the British will bail you out after the war.
Yeah, but that's a strange thing. That's a strange sort of notion to hold on to, that Britain will bail Guernsey out after the war, because isn't that basically saying that whoever thinks that Britain is going to win the war?
Yeah, I know, exactly. And Kratzer's thinking that's the case. But Lille goes to great lengths, and Louis Guillemette, to explain we're financially independent. They're not going to bail us out. But the Germans were unconvinced by this argument. It's just totally bizarre. And as we know, the situation was post-war, they weren't going to bail us out.
No.
It took a long time to get an arrangement which sorted out the whole mess. And even then, it wasn't ideal. But also, they banned them transferring credits to France. So also, they had 750,000 in Barclays in Guernsey, which was completely useless to them because they couldn't you'd send the money to Granville to get it changed into French francs. It had only been stolen by the Germans by that point anyway. So
yeah. And we come up against the procedure for distribution of a prostitute's earnings in France. Now, this is really quite interesting, isn't it?
Well,
You've amended our script here, and it says takes a bit of explaining. Do you want to have a go?
This I'd not come across this before, but Louis basically gets a call from the manager of Barclays Bank, a Frenchman who's in charge of the German military brothel, has requested to transfer 40,000 marks to France, and the chap is concerned about what the heck's going on. And apparently the procedure would be for this money to go through the clearing in Paris, but as far as the actual cash was concerned, the marks would remain in the local bank and would have to be bought by the states at the same way that all other surplus marks were purchased. Thus, the transfer would cost the states the full amount transferred, and we get nothing back in return. So he takes it up with the Germans. There's a lot of to and froing and arguing, but in the end, they have to go along with it. They do basically that he's told by the Feldkommandant, or you can complain about it as much as you like, but that's what's going to happen. And it also happened. It wasn't just the French sex workers. It was also one of the companies that ran the Soldatenheim, the social club, and they used to sell small articles to the Germans, bits and pieces for them. They also took advantage of this as well. So you're going to be really peed off about this, because not only are you banned from actually transferring money to France yourself to go and buy supplies for the island, you're now having money confiscated effectively to pay for the shenanigans at the brothel, which is then getting paid across to France.
Yeah, well, Louis sums it up. He says it is a moment that captures the moral contortions of occupation. Ireland pays for the exploitation of women it did not employ in a system it did not choose.
Yeah.
Sums it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get on to something a bit lighter.
Music in the dark.
Music in the dark. Yeah, so there is a lighter note in the diaries at this point. Louis has a bit of a happy moment when his friend Harry Broughton comes around for supper. We've talked about Harry before. He helped do a bit of babysitting when Louis's wife was in hospital, and between the pair of them, they had to learn how to look after a baby. But Harry, his friend, comes around and it's described as carrying two treasures: recordings of Grieg and Rachmaninoff No. 2 piano concertos. And he's almost got childlike joy when he says, I've retasted the bliss which I had not known since I first discovered big music. For 2 or 3 hours each evening, the wall falls away, the gramophone becomes a sanctuary. I mean, it's a very depressing time at this point. So that must have been a real boost for his own personal well-being.
Yeah, as they say nowadays. Yeah. The other thing, of course, that literally feeds into well-being is food. Louis has managed to get the fat ration increased by 2 ounces a week.
Yeah, he didn't think it was going to happen, to be honest. And Ord notes that there's been no meat ration for ages, no Sunday roast, only vegetables endlessly boiled and endlessly repeated. He's absolutely fed up of just eating boring vegetables.
Yeah, and it wouldn't do you any good.
I'd be completely screwed. Because they weren't even the vegetables that I do eat.
No. And he says that, well, he writes, of course, about the real hassle of housewives trying to get up early in the morning to cook whilst they have got gas supplies, of workers coming home on empty stomachs, and the creeping exhaustion that comes from months of malnutrition. And in fact, we lost a family member to starvation or malnutrition in March 44. So my poor old gran, trying to cook on old pans, probably just balancing on coals in the oven on the fire in some case. But as you say, if he puts in for this 2 ounces per person, what would have constituted fat, like margarine or cooking oil,
It's probably lard, that sort of
lard. Yeah. Amazingly, we moved from food, but amazingly, in the Channel Islands Month Review, which is a publication for Channel Islanders resident in the UK, evacuees, the powers that be, or the powers that want to be, are already talking about town planning. And this is across the Channel Islands? Or?
Yeah. It's Channel Islands. And it's not a grand vision for what things are going to look like. It's basically how we're going to put this back together. And one of the things that they make very, very clear, which I think is quite... They published this in the north of England, the printing of it, etc. And one of the things that they talk about is they don't want to build the sort of stark type buildings that they're living in.
Yeah, what they've seen.
What they've seen in those northern industrial cities. They don't want that. But then they're pondering over how they rebuild the island's identity. How do they put everything back as it should be? And but equally they talk about avoiding a careless pre-war sprawl across the island. The slow erosion of farmland, quiet loss of character. You could be actually talking about some of the debates that go on at the moment about planning. These are all sorts of themes. Long-term plans. Not for the people, but with them, making sure there's access to beaches, preservation of wild headlands, and a renewed respect for the island's natural beauty. But they'll be going to be really, really miffed when they get back and see what it looks like, because it's a mess.
But it's a real attempt, really, to say, look, we can use the occupation as a reset. And as you say, it's a key phrase here, for the people, not for the people, but with the people. So they're talking about resetting democracy in a way, or the way that democracy works after living under totalitarianism. And even people that were, in inverted commas, free in the UK were still restricted by the current wartime restrictions. And so there is some sort of philosophical thinking here about how things should be in the islands afterwards.
There's a lot of optimism in the article as well, and a real belief in the community. It's almost like, when we went through COVID.
Very good. Very good parallel to make. Yeah.
That sort of thing. And how they've been tested by hardship, but they want to come together to do something better and get everything back to how it should be. It's an interesting piece. I'll stick the front page of that on our social media or in the show notes, so that people can have a read of it themselves and see what they think.
We move on to military matters now. Some rumours, or certainly diary entries, talking about 2 British intelligence officers at large on the island.
This turns up in all the diaries, or nearly all of the diaries. I can find absolutely nothing. I've looked for this numerous times. I can find nothing evidential which shows this actually happened.
We have some names here, don't we? Made up names.
I mean, the names are either Richards or Richardson, but the whole, I guess there may have had somebody come ashore, intelligence gathering. I'm not sure that they would have done, because by this stage they'd already binned off. This rumours might have come about in December 43. We've had the hardtack raid on Sark, the hardtack raid on Jersey, which everybody knows about by this point. The words got round. We'll talk about another consequence of that in a while. But so there's been rumours floating around since the end of 43. Oh, there's been another raid, and there's been Spies are here and all this sort of stuff. But I think that's just whipped up by that. But when you see what they talk about here, no, I just don't think it could have happened. The Allies had already decided as well. They did have a raid planned for January 44, which almost went ahead. And Anders Lassen VC was due to take part in that raid. They were going to attack shipping in St. Peterborough Harbour. They were going to use kayaks, or what, I can't remember the exact term, but the canoes, a bit like the Cockleshell Heroes type thing. They were going to come in and they were going to stick some limpet mines on German shipping and sink it in St. Peterborough Harbour. But they decided, no, we need to refocus now. We need to reset. We need to concentrate on France because D-Day's coming. So they binned it off. It didn't happen.
And we weren't really included in D-Day planning, were we?
No. The only thing we were worried about D-Day wise was the few guns that could the few guns that could fire onto the French coast from Alderney, and the radars that we had here, which we'll come to later on in the June 44 episode. We'll talk about that, because they could have, they did detect the invasion air armada, but we'll talk about that later. So I think this is probably unlikely. It may be that somebody came ashore, who knows, but I just can't find anything that proves that it happened. And when you look at the rumour that's going round, it's two men speaking excellent English went to the baker's and offered 20 marks for a loaf of bread. And the baker said he was sure they were Englishmen. A cyclist coming down St. Julian's Avenue in the dark knocks a man over. The man says, "Why don't you ride on the right side of the road?"
Yeah, but the thing about bread is interesting, because they did take, I think when they were in Sark, they wanted to take a load.
They took some bread.
Because they used to analyse the bread, because they felt there was a correlation in the composition of bread would tell you a lot about how conditions were in place.
But going back to the cyclist on St. Julian's Avenue, the guy says to him, "Why don't you ride on the right side of the road?" He's then supposedly given the chap a box of English cigarettes and told him to keep his mouth shut. I mean, you're not going to be wandering around with a box of English cigarettes on you if you're on a covert mission, are you?
I wouldn't have thought so. Not if you're any good.
Not if you didn't want to get caught, or if you got caught, you didn't want to be...
The nearly secret agent.
But Richards or Richardson are the names that are bandied about. But as I say, they turn up in numerous things. They supposedly landed at Cherbourg. One of the diaries says Cherbourg. I think it's just an autocorrect has crept in the republication of it. But apparently they knocked on the door of a house and the homeowner refused to let them in. He said it was too dangerous. And apparently so this makes sense for kind of up St. Martin's Way, maybe a bit further along the coast towards the Trellard. Apparently 2 German tank men they're described as, who were living in a billet across the road. It came out and a fight breaks out. They break the one German's arm and the other's face is smashed, and the officers escape into the night.
Well, certainly there were tank men in that part of the island, because that's where the tank regiment...
Yeah, behind the Trellard Hotel.
Yes, by the Villette, that's right. Now, one thing that does come to my mind is that talking to members of the Channel Island Occupation Society, there are a few that have this belief in a raid that took place in February 1944 on the basis that a black inflatable was found at Petitbow. Now, how it's been explained to me is that a black inflatable would have been used by covert forces, because rescue inflatables were yellow, colour that could be seen for rescue purposes. Some special forces came ashore, there was exchange of gunfire, and they disappeared into the night. Now, we have a very, very well-established military historian here, Simon Hamill, that listeners may be aware of his works. And I asked Simon about this, and he said he'd had access to German regimental diaries, daybooks, and he said nothing at all.
Yeah.
Is mentioned, but there was a sort of reaction to this, wasn't there? Because there was a knocking down, I think, of a building at Petitbow, and you yourself have been to see the remains of a house that may have been fortified. Is that correct?
No, they knocked down a house just down from the Manor Hotel, which had become overgrown, etc. And there's now owned by the National Trust. They asked me to go and have a look at the site because they were wondering, had it been used? There seemed to be evidence that there was potentially a machine gun position there, which would have made sense because it would have...
A German machine gun position.
Yeah. Would have made sense because from there you could prevented somebody from coming up and round the corner. Up the hill from the beach. But like you say, I'm with Simon on this one. I've looked all over the place and for a number of years, and I can't find anything. It doesn't mean it didn't happen.
No.
It's just there's no record of it. I'm sorry, but if a German had had his arm broken and the other one really badly damaged face, and there'd have been a lot about this. I think this is probably the rumours coming off the back of the hardtack raids, the fact that Germans are absolutely crapping themselves about the fact that the Allies might try and retake the islands, and they're conducting searches around the islands. They're knocking down houses on the coast to prevent them from being used by a landing force. I mean, it was about 200 houses in total, I think, around the coast of Guernsey alone that were knocked down to prevent them from being used. by any invading force as cover.
Yes, indeed. I'm working on a possible raid that was recorded raid that could have happened much earlier in the war. And indeed, I focused in on a building that was finally demolished much later than many people think. But it was for that express purpose. They were worried about special forces coming ashore and being able to set up some sort of holding position. And a lot of buildings were continued to be destroyed much later, around this time, late 43. I've got, well, you've helped me with some translation of documents, and eventually these buildings are being destroyed in 1944.
It's a bit of a mystery.
Yeah,
I mean, it'd be interesting if something surfaces in an archive somewhere, then maybe. But
or a diary.
Or a diary.
But even a diary, not exactly the same.
I'd prefer to find a report in an archive.
Exactly, yeah.
Something that's got...
Okay.
Got hard evidence in it.
Well, yes, so would I. And that part of the island, St. Martin's in Guernsey, an American plane is fired upon by a German battery, and a shell enters a house in St. Martin's.
Yeah, the aircraft was flying quite low. They fired quite low, ended up going through a window and laying waste to the room. Fortunately, the occupant wasn't in his usual seat because he was right close to the fire because he didn't have much firewood and he needed to keep himself warm. So he was fine. But I find this hilarious.
Yeah, I know which bit you're going to come and say now.
So a lot of the civilian population are saying, bloody Americans, wouldn't have happened if it was the RAF, because apparently this hadn't happened in the RAF, and they were blaming the Americans. It was all their fault, which I thought was quite entertaining.
Yes, typical. And then we also hear about an American plane raiding Fort George, an old Napoleonic fort that doesn't exist anymore, that the Germans had taken up residence in, and there was a raid there, killing allegedly 19 German combatants, but we're a bit sceptical on the numbers, Nick, aren't we?
Well, no doubt there were Germans that were killed up at Fort George by aircraft that were flying over and decided to machine gun, etc. But whether it's 19, 9 or 1 or whatever, who knows? I was just saying to you earlier before we started recording, it's quite difficult because obviously with one entire German cemetery, they were exhumed and reinterred elsewhere in France. So you haven't got those, gravestones to look at dates and see if there's anything that correlates. So there's very little that I've seen that helps with that. I must confess, it's not something that I've really gone into. Again, there's that fantastic book about the military cemetery that still exists up at Fort George. But it's a bit of a mystery. Also, I would have thought there would have been something in the papers, and there's nothing.
No.
Who knows? Another thing that comes off the back of what we were talking about just before, in terms of the Germans being nervous and having to demolish houses, etc., off the back of the hardtack raids, is the military ordered all in Little Sark to leave their homes, take their cattle and move to mainland Sark. And even then you weren't allowed to live around the coast. Yeah,
it should be. Sark is a small island. It might come as a surprise to some people that it actually is like a bigger part of Sark, and then there's a very, very narrow causeway, and then there's what we call Little Sark, which is, well, it's quite a big area. So Sark is almost two separate islands, almost. So they move them off the very small promontory, almost you'd call it, I suppose, a bit bigger than a promontory. But then that was become a German military area. All civilians and all the livestock were moved
inland, yeah. And it's like having two islands. If you are not familiar with Sark, it's like having two islands. And there's a thing called the coupe, which is basically a
narrow land bridge.
Yeah. But basically, it's a few hundred feet either side. You're straight down onto the beach, down the cliff. Now, if you were reading the Telegraph this week, don't believe what you saw in the Telegraph.
Oh dear, don't.
Because they got a bit confused between Little Sark being joined to Big Sark by the coupe, and said that the coupe actually joined Guernsey to Little Sark, which I could see would cause some shipping hazards, for one thing.
Oh.
It might make getting to Jersey a little bit difficult, a bit of a long way round for the ferry. And
do you know something? When the Falklands War started, there were asking people if they knew where the Falklands were. And some people were saying off the coast of Scotland and all this sort of thing.
I know.
The ignorance about the geography of our Channel Islands, mind you, it's the Daily Telegraph, to say no more, but the universal ignorance, which is probably the best word, of British islands off the coast of, not far from British mainland, you'd think people would be a little bit better informed.
I mean, they had a lovely picture of the coupe.
It was.
But it was just the text underneath that just made me laugh.
Right, artillery practice. Now, this is in Cattell Parish, which is a sort of, where the happens is they're basically artillery practice. Parishioners are told that they must take shelter in the parish church. This is nowhere near the coast. This is not bang in the middle of the island, but is quite a ways inland. And so they were just basically telling people you've got to leave your homes.
Yeah, it happened all the time.
Yeah.
It was a weekly event pretty much for most of the occupation. All around the island, various different areas of the island get evacuated because they're having artillery practice. Thursdays seem to be a popular day. Don't know why, but creatures of habit.
Yeah.
Or whatever, but
computer says Thursday artillery practice.
Whatever. But I mean, even in St. Peterborough, get moved out of bits of St. Peterborough because they've been lobbing shells off of their targets just outside the harbour, practicing in case anybody's trying to take the harbour.
Yeah, and of course, these guns, the batteries, aren't necessarily in sight of where they're firing way over the island, aren't they? So there's not as if they can see what they're aiming at. So at least some thought for the civilian population.
No, they've got spotters going left a bit.
Yeah. Aircraft down. Quite a lot of military aircraft. Well, there's only military aircraft, of course. There's quite a bit to get through here, Nick. You've done a tremendous amount of digging here. A lot of activity, of course. Do you want to start talking us through this?
Yeah. If anybody likes the Typhoon, I think it's a fantastic aircraft. You might be a bit sad about some of this. There's quite a few Typhoons involved in these stories. So the first one is a chap from 193 Squadron, Flight Sergeant King Megget, and his aircraft was based at RAF Harrowbeer in Devon. He crashed into the sea 10 miles north of Cap de la Hague, west of Cherbourg, so near to Alderney. He'd been on a Ramrod, RAF Ramrod 129. On the 4th of February, the Ramrod missions were offensive fighter bomber missions taking place at the time. He was in a Typhoon Mark 1B. It was they think he was trying to attack V weapon sites or some other military infrastructure on the French coast, again in preparation for D-Day. So unfortunately that led to John Richard King Megget never being recovered because he went down into the sea. He's commemorated on the Runnymede Memorial, Egham in Surrey. It's near Windsor. I've been there. It's quite a thing to see. All of those names that are commemorated there on the memorial. And then we've got another one, which is 263 Squadron. Now, there's a number of these aircraft are from 263 Squadron that we can talk about here. If you've listened to earlier episodes, they were the first and last squadron to operate the Whirlwind twin-engined fighter bomber that was harassing shipping around the Channel Islands a lot, and we talked about them quite a bit. They stopped operating the Whirlwind in November 43, right at the end of November. I think it was 28th of November 1943, and they re-equipped with the RAF Typhoon fighter bomber, and they were based at Beaulieu, and they were back in action again towards the end of January 44, and come February the 5th, so the day after the previous incident, he was involved dive bombing targets in northern France and attacking shipping in the Channel. And he took off with another chap, Flight Sergeant Cooper, as a pair at 9 o'clock at night. They were on a shipping wreck going Alderney, Guernsey, Cap de la Hague, and across northern France. We've got a photograph of him, which I'll put up. His name was Norman Peter Blacklock. He reported the presence of Class 2 enemy shipping and asked for emergency homing, saying that he was going in for attack. Nothing more was heard from him except for a weak message over the radio that possibly said, "I'm going into a drink." There was a report written by a flying officer who said almost certainly that Blakelock, who was experienced in night attacks, went in to attack one of the ships, and it's likely the aircraft was hit by flak. Air Sea Rescue patrols were flying in the Cap de la area without success by the squadron on the next day. I mean, unless he'd got into a dinghy, he would have obviously perished.
Well, Flight Sergeant Cooper, though, he did return safely.
Yeah, he did. He landed in RAF Herne near Bournemouth an hour and a half after they'd taken off. But they had spotted 6 German E-boats, so it's quite possible that he was shot down attacking them.
Okay, then we also have here, is this an Australian aircraft?
No, or the chap is from he's Royal Australian Air Force, but he is with 263 Squadron again now. That they have an absolute shocker of a day on the 22nd of February 1944. They must have been quite devastated by this, to be honest, those that survived. They'd sent off aircraft on a fighter sweep over occupied France. They were based at Beaulieu in the New Forest, although for this mission they'd gone to RAF Harrowby in Devon for whatever reason. The weather over the French coast was poor with heavy cloud, and they abandoned the sweep there and decided to come and have a look round the Channel Islands to see if there was any shipping that they could attack or anything else. But things sort of went pear-shaped fairly quickly. So squadron leader Geoffrey Barrington Warnes, he was the commanding officer of the squadron, and he suffered an engine failure and was forced to ditch in the sea about 8 miles northwest of Guernsey. The other pilots circled while he escaped the aircraft, and they saw him swimming towards what appeared to be an uninflated dinghy. Flying officer Robert Bruce Bob Tough, an Australian pilot, in his Typhoon radioed he intended to bail out to help the CO, despite warnings from another pilot that the conditions made rescue almost impossible. He was never seen again.
Right, so what we have here is that Geoffrey Barrington Warnes has engine failure. His aircraft goes into the water. He is then seen swimming towards an uninflated dinghy.
Yeah.
Then another pilot in a separate aircraft says, I'm going to bail out of my aircraft. And these are single occupancy planes, aren't they? So effectively, he's in no danger whatsoever.
Yeah, he's going to bail out, take the dinghy with him to go and
try and rescue the other chap.
Yeah.
That is incredible.
But unfortunately, he was never seen again.
Both men perish.
Yeah. And then another pilot, the flying officer Robert Charles Hunter, continued circling as the drama unfolded below. At some point during this period, his aircraft also went missing. He's described as in the squadron records as having disappeared while circling in the area, and no wreckage or body was recovered.
So we don't know what happened to his craft.
No, apparently the sea was rough and the water was extremely cold with little chance of survival for anybody forced down. They did fly out search missions the next day, but to no avail. It would seem that these were 3 really experienced pilots, and there is an indication or a thought that perhaps they were under a lot of pressure in the run-up to invasion for D-Day, and that's perhaps they were operating in conditions where they may not have done otherwise.
And also under a degree of exhaustion, stress, etc. And because of calamity, life and death is quite incredible.
But I mean, it comes to something when one of the officers deliberately bails out to go and help the squadron boss. It must have been an extremely good command.
Yeah.
For somebody to bail out of an aircraft voluntarily, knowing that it was a slim chance.
247 Squadron Typhoon now.
Yeah, we're still going with aircraft. We've got a couple more. Again, this is another Typhoon, but from 247 Squadron. He ended up in the Channel 4 miles east from Sark, got into his and was seen boarding his dinghy. I love this description. One of the other pilots said he appeared to be calm and collected, and his subsequent escape from the aircraft and descent were carried out very efficiently. After this, I missed him in the heavy swell, but reported his position. The wind was blowing northwest, and there must have been a good chance he was washed ashore. Unfortunately, he didn't survive, and his body was washed up sometime later not until the end of March 44, near St. Briac in France. So his body had travelled quite a long way.
And then we're going next to our United States Marauder.
Yeah, I don't know too much about this one. This is a bit of a mystery. I've not been able to find out too much about it, other than we know who the crew were, we know where it took off, which was French Morocco. when I first looked this up, I'm like, hang on, what's going on? I must have the wrong aircraft here. But checked again. No, I haven't just looked up the wrong aircraft. It really did take off in French Morocco. And it was heading for RAF St Morgan, which is in Cornwall. And it fell, it was crossing the French coast just at the north of Brittany. And for some reason unknown, it crashed, so it may well have been shot down by the Germans. But there's nothing recorded. There's nothing which explained it. The bodies were found in a dinghy on a beach, so they'd obviously managed to successfully get into the dinghy. They were found, I think it's Panto, so on the sort of top of the Brittany coast there.
So this is due to wet exposure,
presumably. Yeah, they just died from exposure, I imagine.
Well, what a way to go. Right, Nick, before we go, let's finish with...
yes,
let's lighten the mood.
If anybody looked at our social media yesterday, I caused a little bit of a stir, I think, with some images that it's going to confuse the heck out of people. So I put up a picture of what is apparently a cat, although I'm absolutely rubbish at drawing, and I couldn't have drawn. But I'm a bit puzzled. It says, I don't feel well.
It didn't look very well.
No, it's green. I'm guessing the green only happened because that was the only colour paint that they had for the cat, sort of green and yellow cat. What I did was I cut the top off of this because it would have given it away. Because this is off the cover of a pantomime that was held in one of the internment camps in Germany, in Bad Wurzach, which is a Schloss, so a castle in southern Germany, where there were about 600 Jersey people there who'd been deported. I thought it was just quite interesting that I came across this, and they did Cinderella, a pantomime in 2 acts, and it ran for 2 nights on January 31st and February the 1st, and it was written and devised by C. Tipping and Mrs. Ray, with incidental music, songs and dances arranged by Mrs. Ray and produced by Mrs. Ray, music throughout by Mrs. Ray, assisted by the camp orchestra. And they typed up this program, and there seemed to be a whole host of people that were involved in. We've got soldiers and elves. There's about 12 of them. A chorus of villagers and guests, nymphs and fairies. There's a lot of nymphs and fairies in this. Pages, all sorts going on. It's got 6 scenes in it, and there's a dog in it. There's the cat, obviously, because obviously I'll put the picture of the cat on there. Got a demon king. There's a whole host.
It sounds a bit cosmic, really.
I mean, it's a fantastic thing to see. And then they didn't just have the one edition of the souvenir program. They had another one which had a prince on, or apparently a prince. Although it does look, he's got a tail by the looks of it. I think that's supposed to be his sword sticking out. And that's Prince Charming. So I just thought those were quite nice things to see. Obviously, we're describing them on radio, so it's not quite the same for you guys, but we can share some of that on our social media, and I'll put it in the show notes and so that people can see. I just thought it was an interesting little snippet. That was one of the things that they had was trying to keep themselves busy, keep away from boredom and stuff like that. Brilliant that they produced.
We discussed in a much earlier episode this possibility of a German soldier speaking patois.
Yes.
Well, I've managed to delve quite a little bit into that, and one of the things that I was sent in the week by Sue Laker at the Prio Library was a list of people that was published in the local paper in 1915, which has confirmed the existence of a large German community here on the islands. So it's not impossible at all that we could have had families growing up here and having children who by the time of the war would have been adults and married into local families. So I've got some names that are looking promising, so I'm continuing to dig there. Okay, I think that's the end of the show, end of this podcast.
Yeah, I think I've finished waffling on for enough now.
Yeah, well, so that's the end of February 1944. Of course, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be talking about March 1944. And if you have any thoughts or queries or suggestions, anything to add at all, Nick and I really do appreciate being in contact, and you can get hold of us, Occupied GNet Radio. March is closer to D-Day. We'll probably start seeing lots of things that are preparing the ground with that, but otherwise things get tougher in the islands as we head towards later in 1944. So I think it's goodbye time.
Yeah, I think so. Excellent.
With that,
time to say goodbye.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for
Cheerio.
listening. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and family had gone. Left on a ship 'cause they knew